Well, thank you. I think we're ready to get started. That was a great meal that Chef Victor and the gang produced. And thank you all for coming. I've got some old college friends, some law school friends, some clients, but I was in private practice a long time ago. And to say nothing of the Cliff Dweller regulars. And Charlie, I see you back at the bar. Thanks for being here rather than watching Snow White streaming now on Disney+. So, in the 1950s, I was curious, as maybe many of you were. In fact, let's see the number of hands, people that remember the Nike missile sites. So that's over half. Good, because if you told younger people that we had nuclear weapons stored in our parks and harbors today, they wouldn't buy it. But I remember poking around the Belmont harbor site a little bit. And in the early 60s, at college, I was a political science major, and I took a course in international relations that focused on the competition, the nuclear competition between the U.S. and the USSR in the first decade of the Cold War. It was very, very interesting. I remember assigned reading included Henry Kissinger, then a Harvard professor. He was one of the few academics writing about that kind of thing then. And as the Vietnam War grew apace in that period, I came back to Chicago, went to law school, and then, which is why we have this subject before us tonight, I had the most extraordinary and unexpected postgraduate education in anti-ballistic missile defense. And it was all thanks to the Army. And I've kept an eye cocked on this area of life in the news in the decades since, but I was sort of taken back to this subject last fall when I noticed that, and this was just striking, it may have struck you the same way, the President and the Congress actually agreed on something. And, after being thunderstruck, I went into it, and of course what they agreed on was the creation of the Space Force and the attendant Space Command. Because the Army had given me this strange education, last fall was the half-century anniversary of my working on the Nike successor, the Safeguard Anti-Ballistic Missile System, and it had taken me out to Kwajalein Atoll in the Western Pacific. It was then the western terminus of the Pacific Missile Test Range. I got into that quite deeply at the time, looking into counterespionage and counter-sabotage issues that affected the missile system that was then under development and hadn't been deployed. So I'll talk about the Nikes in Chicago. I'll talk a little bit about the Safeguard system. I'll throw in a little bit of Cold War history. And I'll talk about what has been going on that leads us at this particular point in our history to have our military focus on space as a potential war theater that we need to deal with. And then finally, I'll close with a couple of comments about the Doomsday Clock and how it's ticking. So when I was looking into this last fall, I found there had been so much going on I knew nothing about. I came back to our past president, Eve Moran, and head of our program, Joan Pancius, and said, I think this might be interesting. What do you think? They said yes. So that's why we're here. And should this little talk bore the peewalla out of you, join me in blaming those two for getting us into this mess. So I hope you find this whole subject as interesting and fascinating as I have over the years, albeit, of course, a worrisome matter to be talking about, to be thinking about. So in the 1950s, you see here, this was the national deployment of the Nike missile defenses. There were 40 defense areas, and there were 200 Nike batteries spread among these defense areas. And the defense areas were chosen because of their perceived value to the Soviets in a Soviet nuclear bomber attack. So the targets included Chicago and other large cities, Air Force ICBM bases, and the like. Chicago was the largest of all of those sites in the U.S. Now see, those of you that remember Nike, see if you can find your suburban location on that map. On the top right is the site in Jackson Park, and below that is the Belmont Harbor launch site. The Belmont Harbor radars were located just to the north at Montrose Harbor, and former President Bill Getzoff told me the other day that when he was in the Illinois National Guard, he actually patrolled those radars. So thank you for your service, Bill. I'm sure at that particular time, knowing how good he would be on guard duty, I'm sure not one Viet Cong got across the perimeter. So the first Nike missiles were armed with enough conventional explosives to take out a single Soviet bomber. And then in 1958, more is always better, nuclear warheads were put on the Nikes so that they could take out multiple bombers simultaneously. This is a short film clip that is an Air Force film done for the Air Force, and it's about the Thor missile that had been developed hurriedly in the 1950s and sent to Europe because our own ICBM force was not ready at the time.
Let us recall the birth of Thor, and, as a matter of fact, the reasons leading to its conception. Like most war babies, Thor was conceived by international tensions. When the Russian bear came out of hibernation with a hydrogen growl, we needed a big stick, and we needed it fast. We had already begun development of 5,000-mile intercontinental ballistic missiles, but while the ICBM program was proceeding favorably, operational availability was still years away. We did have the immediate deterrent force of the Strategic Air Command, but how long could our bombers alone hold the Russian bear in check?
This history of the 1990s was prepared by the National Park Service, which inherited some of the Nike sites and also the Army Corps of Engineers, which had designed them. But by 1974, all of these were gone. So there's no Cold War tourism for Nike sites left in Illinois. I had enlisted in 1968 in the Army's intelligence branch for...
Who's in that picture?
Yes, that's right, the slim Bilbo.
Wow.
By the way, my telephone number, I'll give it to you again. So I went through counterintelligence training at Fort Halbert in Baltimore, and not long ago at the members table I found out that Bob Newman here, who's on our board, had gone through Fort Halbert at about the same time. So thank you for your service, Bob. With the Vietnam War continuing to heat up, many intelligence school graduates went to Vietnam, including Bob. This prisoner interrogation training we had reflected the reality of the Vietnam War going on at the time. I was older than most of my intelligence school classmates and had been through college and law school and even had a year of practice, so I think that's why I ended up assigned to the Counterintelligence Analysis Branch of the Office of the Assistant Chief of Staff for Intelligence of the Army at the Pentagon. Counterintelligence has to do with protecting your secrets and assets from those that would do them harm. With the push on at the time to replace Nike's anti-aircraft capability with an ICBM missile defense, Safeguard was the highest priority. It was the Army's ticket into more modernized future technology. And therefore, one of my first assignments was to assess the counterespionage and counter-sabotage aspects of the program's development. And it was impossible for me to understand those issues unless I hit the road. So I went first to the Redstone Arsenal, where they were designing and managing the development of the system, and then out to Colorado Springs to the headquarters of NORAD. And NORAD, of course, was operating what was then the air defense network into which Safeguard would have to fit. And I got out to Kwajalein Atoll, where they were using state-of-the-art interceptor missiles, radars, optics, to work through the problems in this advanced systems development. And as it turned out, I also made an unplanned stop at Johnston Atoll in the Pacific. As you can see, the Safeguard ABM system didn't last long after I worked on it in 1969. The efforts to develop a national missile defense afterwards never really went anywhere, in part due to arms control agreements and continuing technology limitations, and also, as time went on, a reluctance to potentially upset the nuclear stalemate between the U.S. and the USSR. After I left the Army in 1971, and before Safeguard was deployed, the Soviets and the U.S. had already agreed to limit their ABM defenses to only 2 sites. And in '76, both of those the U.S. had unilaterally closed. And in the 1980s, Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative, called Star Wars, produced no defensive weapons, although it did help trigger the bankruptcy and ultimate dissolution, in part, of the Cold War. The U.S. withdrew from this treaty in 2002, and that was because there was a new player on the scene, one we seem to be dealing with as well again today, North Korea. The only 2 Safeguard sites ever built, one was in Montana at an ICBM air base, and the other in North Dakota. Now, if you can believe it, this is the North Dakota Michelson Safeguard Complex in Nakoma, North Dakota, population 48. It is a Cold War tourist destination site, folks. And today, tourists drop by and they take a look at the missile site radar up top, and below it you see the fields for the Spartan and Sprint missiles and their silos. And here's a gaggle of tourists now, and I'm sure you know just what they were thinking. Why spend the money to see the great pyramids in Egypt and Las Vegas? Well, we've got a pretty good pyramid here in Nakoma. In ICBM, defense speed is of the essence, as you would expect. And one way to speed things up would be not to have heavy metal hatches on the silos, but a styrofoam hatch that the missile could just blow through quite quickly, no waiting for it to open. And note the fence around this missile field. I was given pause about the styrofoam option when my research turned up the fact that at an Air Force ICBM base, high schoolers had gotten over the perimeter fence. And what do? You paint your high school class year on the silo cover. So after being briefed on Safeguard basics at Redstone, it was off to Cheyenne Mountain. And this slide depicts the complicated current role of NORAD Operations Center in a battle to destroy incoming ICBMs. You access the NORAD headquarters by getting on a bus and driving deep into the mountain through a tunnel. You get out of the bus, you go through 2 blast-proof vault doors, and you come into this enormous cavern that opens up, and the granite mountain is now filled in this cavern with multi-story prefabricated office structures that sit on enormous I-beams, and they and their utility connections are all spring-loaded. So when the Soviet ICBM hits the mountain, you know, they're stirred and not shaken. It still is able to function in a normal fashion. So after I had this education about how Safeguard fit in, I sent my mother a postcard at home, and I joked to her that the site of my pre-battle nuclear attack briefing took place sensibly at the Air Force Academy's chapel. I then traveled to Honolulu to board a military flight to Kwajalein, and it stopped to refuel at Johnston Atoll, one of the strangest places I have ever been to in my life. A little bit of history. The Sally discovered the atoll while it was transiting the Pacific, and it ran aground there. And the British captain of the Cornwallis a few years later modestly named the atoll after himself. Commercial development of the atoll's substantial guano deposits began after Congress authorized it in the mid-19th century, and the Tanager and Whippoorwill did scientific surveys in the early 20th century, and not surprisingly, in the War in the Pacific during World War II, it was a Naval and Army Air Force refueling depot. Johnston was deactivated in 2004 and briefly and unsuccessfully put on the market by the General Services Administration of the federal government as a resort property. The Cold War came to Johnston in a big way in 1958, when the first of a series of high-altitude nuclear detonations began. As you can see in this picture, Johnston is abandoned today. Note the adjacent graphic shows that the man-made accretions at Johnston all occurred during the peak of the Cold War.
Just a question about that.
Yeah.
Where did they get the landfill material to build up this island?
Maybe they just saved some of the guano. That's a good question. Can I get back to you on that? So the project Fishbowl tests in 1962 were to find out what happens when you detonate a nuclear weapon in space. And U.S. defense planners at the time were worried that Soviet satellites would be carrying a nuclear bomb in orbit and could release it at will on ICBMs in the U.S. or, God forbid, of course, U.S. cities. These early unsuccessful tests results were nothing, however, compared with the spectacular nuclear explosion that was soon set off in the upper atmosphere. The first thing the blast produced was a startling artificial aurora borealis that could be seen all the way from New Zealand to Hawaii, and it lasted for minutes. And no one had expected the startling effects of the electromagnetic pulse. One conclusion was that some countries could have their entire electrical grid knocked out with a single detonation. And the radiation impact on the Van Allen belt and satellites was not foreseen at all. The next year, right after the Cuban Missile Crisis, the nuclear treaty came along. The Limited Test Ban Treaty forbid atmospheric tests, tests underwater, and tests in space. And 6 years after the Limited Test Ban Treaty was signed, what I thought was this direct flight from Honolulu to Kwajalein stopped at Johnston to refuel. And as we were there landing, on either side of the runway, I saw shelters like this, and outside of one was a Thor missile being worked on. And I later found out, read the New York Times one day, and the Thor missiles were part of a secret anti-satellite weapon system authorized by President Johnson, with the capability indeed to shoot down any Soviet satellites carrying nuclear bombs. In the 1990s, after the Vietnam era buildup had ended and Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative helped finally bankrupt the USSR, vast stocks of aging chemical weapons were beginning to leak. A big problem. They were becoming unstable. Where are you going to fix this? Well, what a great thought. Johnston Atoll, of course. And Johnston's new mission became the destruction of the most deadly non-nuclear weapons in the U.S. arsenal. It took over a decade, but this was the furnace that got that job done. At its peak, over 1,200 military and military contractor personnel lived on Johnston, and when the toxic weaponry was gone, all of the housing and all of the other infrastructure was destroyed. Johnston wasn't just decommissioned in a decade and a half ago, it was terminated with extreme prejudice. Personally, I doubt that Johnston will ever become the busy Cold War tourist mecca that Tacoma has become. It's even more remote. It wasn't discovered until 3 centuries after Columbus, and then only because the ship headed elsewhere ran aground there. For most of its history, it's been filled with bird crap, plutonium debris, and chemical weapons. It's been run down and left vacant for years. It has virtually no significant wildlife. The largest of its big five is a coconut crab. And it's got plenty of fish, but you might die if you eat it. And let's not forget that its previous tenant failed trying to sell it. Of course, on the plus side, if you want to think about it that way, it was once the site of the first and only artificial sunrise known to mankind. Kwajalein Atoll, here's Kwajalein Island, the largest of 90 coral islets, surrounds these islets to the world's largest lagoon. And this is the southernmost with a little bit over a square mile. Their research and weapons system functions here and on nearby Mek and northern Roynamore Islands. These were the local counterespionage threats of the day. The problem with computer emanations was a security issue that was not limited to Kwajalein. It also had to be thought about in the mainland. And of course, that's pretty common taking care of that today. In 1969, a Minuteman missile, the ICBM of ours at the time, was yanked with its crew at random from their silos. They were trucked to Vandenberg Air Force Base north of San Francisco. The warhead was taken off, an instrument package went in. It was programmed for somewhere in the middle of the Kwajalein Lagoon. And when the re-entry vehicle dropped in, the splash was precisely fixed by radars and optics located around the atoll. And the purpose of all of that was to see how accurate it was. And the reason they wanted to know how accurate it was to see how much of a likelihood they had of taking out, with a single ICBM, a hardened Soviet silo. And of course, when you answer that question, you also have an idea of how well they're going to do at some point in taking out your hardened silos. As I came in for a landing, I could see the Kwajalein Airport terminal there in the foreground. With so little land to spare, multiple radars studded the truncated golf course adjacent, as you see here, to the runway. And on a later round of golf with my minder, sirens and klaxons went off. Quite unexpectedly, I was told that I needed to immediately get off the course and take shelter. And after briefly considering whether to soil myself before or after taking shelter, I just skedaddled, and I never knew exactly why, except either those radars on the golf course were going to fry you, or a missile test gone bad would have the debris caulking you on the head. The terminal building was particularly busy during the rush hour because the commuter planes there were taking day workers up to Mek and Roynamore and bringing them back in the evening. I had traveled to Kwajalein with false documentation as a Department of the Army civilian, and this was to prevent my low rank as an enlisted man from interfering with my interviews and conversations with higher ranking military personnel, MIT scientists, software engineers, and other experts. So for my week stay, I got an upgrade to the Bachelor Officer's Quarter. And you notice that my otherwise beautiful upscale upgraded ocean view was somewhat obstructed by aluminum foil. And I was never sure if the foil was to keep the sun out or to protect me from those radar beams that were all over the place. I I planned to promptly conduct my interviews and then head back to Honolulu, but it was not to be. A congressional delegation had just arrived, a staff delegation to look into a recent missile test failure and judge its impact. So my minder, who happened to be the base recreation officer, took me to the deserted pool, and I spent my days drinking beer there, and if we hadn't back then, I would have been taking selfies instead of just talking to myself. It was lonely indeed. And in the evenings, I could go to the low-life, low-population, high-alcohol arena of the Yakwe Yuck Club. And that club name in Marshallese translates roughly to Aloha. During my time out period, I could see from Kwajalein's harbor the first of my destinations, the missile site radar on nearby Mek. Then, when the congressional staff left, it was aloha for me too, and I was off on one of the commuter planes for my interviews. As I took off, I took this picture. When this experimental radar failed to perform as it had been thought it would, it was taken out of commission, and it was repurposed into what is undoubtedly the most expensive golf driving range anyone will ever go to. And my minder tried to get me to go inside. He told me it was safe. He said it had been unplugged and nobody was allowed to flip it back on. But frankly, I was having none of it. Who wants to go to an island paradise and again run the risk of being fried by stray radar beams? This is a picture of the missile site construction on Mek. The radar requires, as you might imagine, massive computing capacity, all of which resides in that square structure underneath the radar itself. And as I was taken for a tour of the computer area, its proud manager told me that there was more computing power in that room than existed on the planet in the mid-1950s. And for all I know, maybe he was telling the truth. These radars on Moinamur make up what is now known as the Kiernan Reentry Measurement System. And before my interviews up there, I was taken to a cemetery honoring the Japanese war dead. And the Marines landed at Moinamur in January 1944 and took the entire atoll 2 weeks later. And you can see the diver in the lower right there looking at one of the wrecks in the lagoon. The Target Resolution and Discrimination Experiment, or TRADEX, was the first of the radars built at Kwajalein. It became operational in 1962, which is when the MIT scientists from the Lincoln Laboratory arrived to work and live on Kwajalein. Upgrades later permitted it to join the U.S. Space Surveillance Network and also to track foreign missile launches and low Earth and deep space satellites. I would tell you how this and the other radars work, and it's not just because it's classified that I'm not going to. It's because I never had the faintest idea how it worked. On the left is a photo I took of the ARPA long-range tracking and instrumentation radar. It was designed to show how U.S. ICBMs would appear to Soviet anti-ballistic missiles. On the right is a more recent picture of the same radar, upgraded for the Space Surveillance Network, also by MIT. The radar on the left is capable of generating high-resolution images of near-Earth satellites. And on the right, the ARPA Lincoln C-band observables radar was built with the objective of improving re-entry vehicle discrimination. Now, for an anti-ballistic missile radar to work properly, it's got to be able to distinguish what's the warhead coming back into the atmosphere and what are the decoys that are designed to help confuse a defensive radar. So that's a pretty important function. Here are some of the MIT staff on what's now called Reagan Test Site at the Command and Control Center. In 1969, the key rule to follow in killing a Soviet ICBM with a ground-based missile was catch it mid-course. And that rule really hasn't changed until, or to this day, when catching a North Korean missile in mid-course still is a preferred way of doing it. This shows the enhanced role sea-based and space-based detectors now play in missile defense. At some point in the future, Navy ships near Japan may get the opportunity to take out North Korea in the ICBM in the boost phase. This Cobra Dane perimeter acquisition radar has an azimuth of 136 degrees, which makes it well-suited as well as well-sighted to follow North Korean issues. Following the deactivation in '76 in North Dakota, an upgraded perimeter acquisition radar was built at Cavalier, now Air Force Station. And they still scan for ICBMs, but they also are mapping and following all of the objects in Earth orbit, vast numbers today, from astronaut gloves to debris and the like. This particular radar can track multiple objects the size of a basketball at a range of 2,000 miles. The radar on the left is a perimeter acquisition radar attack characterization system in the UK. The one on the right analyzes more than 20,000 tracks a day from giant satellites to space debris. Parks are different than perimeter acquisition radars in that they're able to predict with extreme accuracy where any particular object will be at any particular time. Though both the US and Soviets thought during the Cold War about making the ICBMs harder to hit by having them rove around the country on trains, only the Soviets did so. And their missiles on trains were retired by 2005. And we owe our director, Andrew Fox, recently returned from the St. Petersburg Train Museum for the picture on the lower left there. Thank you for your service to the club dwellers. Amazingly, Russian media announced 3 years ago that after testing, the currently silo and truck-based ICBM on the right there will be rail-mounted and deployed later this year. We'll see. If true, it strikes me as Russia answering a non-problem on the cheap to look like it's doing something. In a more modern twist on the retread of rail-mounted ICBMs, Russia said last December that its new avant-garde hypersonic ICBM was operational, and its re-entry vehicle has the advantage, apparently, of being highly maneuverable as it closes in on its target. A Defense Intelligence Agency report from the fall says that the Chinese have a Mach 5 hypersonic missile. New threats to U.S. Space-based GPS communications and missile launch satellites come from cyber and jamming attacks and kinetic and laser weapons. And in a modern society such as ours, increasingly dependent on satellites for our normal functioning, it's not surprising that serious thought is being given to the potential of being blinded with your satellites taken out. Just look at this wide array of sensors and anti-missile missiles on this chart from the Missile Defense Agency of the Department of Defense. And while it reflects the command and control and battle management and communications challenges, it only hints at the very complex and expensive organizational structure that underlies our missile and now satellite defenses. And this is really what has led to the major restructuring in space defenses that has led to the Space Force and Space Command. A month ago, you may have seen the new insignia of the Space Force, the 16,000 active duty airmen and civilians who used to be in the former Air Force Space Command are now part of the Space Force. And the Space Force and the Air Force both reside within the Department of the Air Force, just as the Marines and the Navy reside within the Department of the Navy. The Space Command is the warfighting command unit for the Space Theater. It's supported by 2 field organizations. The first has 70 Army, Navy, and Air Force space units, and it's worried about maintaining the integrity of GPS navigation and communications satellites for not just US, but also allied commanders. The second field operation operates the classified National Space Defense Center, and that's where they look at potential threats and draw up options if satellites were to come under attack. The U.S. Space Command has now taken its place as the newest of the 11 Department of Defense combatant commands. The Department of Defense's Clandestine National Reconnaissance Office runs the most covert satellite and aerial programs. It controls the satellites that look at and survey world trouble spots, monitor the ebb and flow of nuclear arsenals, and provide the information needed for verifying various arms control agreements. And if war in space ensues, the U.S. Space Command has the ability to order what are called defensive space operations. At the top of the slide, you'll see the words SIGINT and IMINT and MASINT. I knew the first two, image intelligence, signals intelligence. I had to look up MASINT. It's the acronym for Measurement and Signature Intelligence. And how does MASINT work, you ask? Well, I have to quote this precisely. It employs a broad group of disciplines, including nuclear, optical, radio frequency, acoustics, seismic, and material sciences. Wow, I can tell you as an expert, that is never going to be Merriam-Webster's word of the year. In a half century since I spent time in the Army working on missile defense issues, we've grown, of course, exponentially more dependent on satellites and other sensors for every aspect of our military operations. The landscape of nation states with inventories of nuclear warheads has also changed substantially in recent decades. Today we have 9 nuclear powers, with Iran perhaps waiting in the wings as number 10. And so far, the complexity and expense of acquiring nuclear weapons has kept it a game only of nation states. And all of the nation states, of course, share a strong interest in keeping that to be the case. Now just look at the dramatic decline in stockpiles of tactical and strategic nuclear weapons maintained by the U.S. and Russia. We had over 30,000, Russia over 40,000. And you can look at this chart another way and say, well, this perhaps is the global learning curve of learning to live with the bomb. Through the movement of, though the movement of war planning into space has its ominous overtones, it is also true that in this period, the largest nuclear powers have retreated from the brink of war as they came to a better understanding and a better appreciation of the collateral damage to their societies from unrestrained competition. Well, there you have it. We're now living in an age where the potential for war has moved from its traditional Earth surface to Earth orbit. And no doubt in another 50 years it may move along to the moon and Mars and beyond. And I don't know about you, but there's always been, in thinking about this, something otherworldly about it for me. But think about the subject we must, even though it hasn't been much in the public consciousness in the last several decades. It's something, of course, as citizens and humans, we can't really get away from. Shortly after Hiroshima, there was a Rand Corporation fellow, Bernard Brody, and what he did was write something that proved to be all these 75 years later at the heart of the nuclear equation of today, and it's been there all along. He said everything about the atomic bomb is overshadowed by twin facts. It exists, and its destructive power is fantastically great. And because this whole realm is so complex and so dangerous and so expensive and intractable, it looks like future generations such as ours are going to have to just continue to keep grappling with the seriousness of all of this. So as the last charts demonstrate, over this period, most of the nations that could potentially have acquired nuclear weapons have chosen not to. And the leading nuclear nations have actually produced the reduce the prevalence and likely use of the weapons. The older nuclear powers seem to at least partially digested the strange non-utility of nuclear weapons. And it remains an open question as to whether the newer and incipient nuclear powers are going to also assess in a similar way the limited value of acquiring something that is so constricted in its use. Personally, I'm optimistic that we'll avoid a catastrophe in the next 25 years as we move towards the 100th anniversary of Hiroshima. My own belief is that the problem will at least be less dangerous and intractable then in 2045 than it is now. But then, what do I know? So, thank you for your attention.
Is a defensive system practical when we hear that it's like shooting a bullet at a bullet?
That has remained the question, really.
Could you repeat the question?
Yeah, so the question is it really practical to have an anti-missile defense if you're trying to shoot a bullet with a bullet? And the answer is that it remains under investigation. I happened to be dialing this morning. You can see I was very bored. I stopped at CNN. And what were they talking about? Well, our Secretary of Defense was being grilled by a House committee. One of the things they were talking about was exactly this, that there is another generation of anti-missile and missile defense, which seems broader than anything since Safeguard, with not an East Coast one. They're concerned, of course, seriously about Iran now. I mean, these war planners, of course, are typically thinking 10, 20, 30 years out because their weapon systems have that kind of a long life. Look at the B-52s, they're still around there. So the answer is maybe, but those that have the best idea about that that's all would be classified, and but up to this point, it's been too iffy. Yes, Bob.
I had a very good friend who was a relatively high-level consultant to the Pentagon on the radar systems in the 1980s and 90s that were a part of the Star Wars system. In fact, he disclosed that during the 80s and the 90s, the radar systems, which were a key part of, as key a part as the missiles themselves in attempting to shoot down incoming Russian missiles, the radars were not capable. But that's a different situation than most people are talking about today when you're talking about 1 or 2 missiles being fired by the North Koreans or the Iranians, which is a much easier task of shooting down than it was of trying to shoot down these multiple warheads coming from the Russians.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the problems that you touch on there is that it was cheaper for countries to throw their money into the offense than to try and build a defense. The offense has, most of the time, had no overwhelming edge. The other thing about Star Wars, which was based on Edward Keller's idea, he was running late in his career the Livermore Laboratory in the West Coast. The lasers, I've been reading recently, just weren't up to the task. Getting that kind of a laser built with the power to deal with multiple incoming objects over enormous distances in space, it just was a bridge too far. So technological limitations and also this idea that, hey, look, we've stayed away from mutually assured destruction, we've stayed away from the destruction. Do you really want to be unbalancing what seems to have worked in an odd way with a defensive system that might make the other side think that you could ward off a first strike and dump your load on them anyway? The other grand problem, of course, of solving that problem of the other side taking out your ICBMs, there was always a solution from the beginning to that. You see them coming on the radar. Simple. Rather than have your ICBMs knocked out, you launch yours before they get hit. But no rational war planner ever wanted to leave the U.S. president with that kind of a 10 or 15 minute choice to make. So,
I have a question.
yes, Larry.
How much does this stuff cost?
Well, I think you saw the one slide, which is 1970-ish dollars, more or less. I think the Safeguard system was about $25 billion, and that was never really deployed. 2 test sites that may or may not have worked, but were quickly found to be able to be limited by treaty, and then would have been overwhelmed anyway.
At one point in one of your slides, you said we had 6,500 nuclear tipped weapons. What would one of those cost? Any guess?
I don't, but they might be in storage. It's kind of a complicated numbers game. How many warheads are there? Well, there are those that are piled up awaiting their deactivation in accordance with arms control agreements. And then there are those in reserves. And then you've got those that are sitting on the end of a missile that are ready to go instantly. So, well, why don't we break up, have a drink, and talk about something more fun?